Look at the water off your coast right now. It looks the same as it did last summer. It isn't. Underneath that flat, ordinary surface, the ocean is holding more heat than it was the last time a storm like this came ashore. That is the number I want to show you tonight. The one reading almost nobody put on screen this week. Here is what I found. The National Hurricane Center tracks how fast a storm can strengthen, and a pattern confirmed by researchers at Rowan University says these systems are now more than twice as likely to explode from a weak storm into a monster in a single day. That is not a guess. That is measured, published, and sitting in the data right now. I was reading a buoy feed late one night when a single value stopped me cold. Not the wind, not the pressure, the heat locked in the water underneath. Stay with me, because by the end, I am going to show you the exact reading you can check yourself wherever you live and the narrow window it points to. This reaches a lot further inland than you think. Let me start where I started, because the first thing that bothered me was not the storm at all. It was the words being used to describe it. Every forecast I read this week used the same phrase: strengthening, gradually strengthening, expected to become better organized. Soft words, calm words, the kind of words that let you finish your coffee and get on with your day. And for most of the storms I have tracked over the years, those words were honest. Systems used to build slowly. You had days. You watched a tropical wave come off the coast of Africa. You watched it spin up over a week, and by the time it mattered, you had already decided whether to board up or drive north. But that is not how these storms behave anymore, and I can show you exactly where the language and the data stopped agreeing. The National Hurricane Center has a precise definition for what scares them most. They call it rapid intensification. It means a storm's maximum sustained winds jump by at least 35 miles per hour in 24 hours or less. 35 miles per hour of new wind speed in a single day. That is the official threshold. And it exists because that specific kind of jump is the one that kills people who thought they had time. Here is why that number matters to you and not just to a meteorologist. A storm at 75 miles per hour is a Category 1. It is a bad day. You lose some shingles, some power, a few trees come down. A storm at 110 miles per hour is a Category 2 edging toward 3. And now we are talking about structural damage, about roofs peeling, about storm surge that moves cars. Rapid intensification is the bridge between those two worlds, and it can be crossed while you sleep. So when I saw the word gradually in the discussion, I went and pulled the numbers the discussion was built on. And that is where the first crack appeared, because the ocean underneath this system was not set up for gradual anything. Let me explain what actually feeds one of these things. Because once you understand the fuel, you will never read a forecast the same way again. A hurricane is a heat engine. That is not a metaphor. It is mechanically true. It pulls warm, moist air up off the ocean surface. That air rises and cools and dumps its moisture as rain, and that process releases energy that drops the pressure at the center and pulls in even more air faster and faster. Warm water at the top is the throttle. And for decades, the number everyone watched was sea surface temperature, the temperature of the very top layer of the ocean. The magic threshold is about 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that, storms struggle. Above it, they have what they need to grow. And right now, across large stretches of the Gulf and the Western Atlantic, surface temperatures have been running in the high 80s. I saw readings near 88 and 89 degrees on the buoys. That alone would be enough for the news to say, warm water may fuel the storm, and move on. But surface temperature was never the whole story. And this is the exact place the coverage stops and my investigation begins. Because a storm does not just sit on top of the water and sip from the surface. It churns. Its own winds tear the ocean up, dragging deeper water toward the top. And normally, that is the storm's own worst enemy. When it churns up cold water from below, it chokes off its own fuel supply and weakens. That self-limiting break is the reason most storms in history did not become monsters. They cooled the very water they were feeding on. So the real question, the one I could not find answered anywhere in the headlines, was not how warm is the surface. It was how deep does the warm water go? And that is where I found the reading that made me look twice. There is a measurement most people have never heard of. It is called ocean heat content. Scientists at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, specifically at their laboratory in Miami, track it constantly. It measures not just the temperature of the surface, but how much heat is stored in the entire column of warm water from the surface down to where the water finally cools to about 79 degrees Fahrenheit. They call that boundary the 26 degrees Celsius isotherm, which is just a scientific way of saying the floor of the warm layer. Here's why you need to care about a depth reading you have never heard of. When that warm layer is shallow, the storm churns up cold water fast and stalls out. When that warm layer is deep, there is no cold water for the storm to reach. It churns, and it just keeps finding more warm water. The break is gone. The engine runs wide open. Researchers measure this in units of kilojoules per square centimeter, and you do not need to memorize that. You need one benchmark. When ocean heat content climbs above about 90 of those units, rapid intensification becomes dramatically more likely. Above 100, storms have exploded. And in the Gulf this season, in the path this system is taking, I was looking at values well past that line. That was the moment the word gradually stopped making sense to me, because the surface said warm, but the deep water said loaded. So I did what I always do when one reading contradicts the calm version of the story. I went looking for whether anyone had already proven this was a pattern and not a fluke. And what I found was a study that reframed everything. In 2023, a researcher named Andra Garner at Rowan University published work in the journal Scientific Reports that did something simple and devastating. She looked at every Atlantic hurricane over roughly the last 50 years and asked one question: how likely is a storm to jump from a weak Category 1 to a major Category 3, or stronger within 24 hours? Then she compared two eras, the storms from 1970 to 1990 and the storms from 2001 to 2020. The answer was that the odds of that violent overnight jump had more than doubled. In the earlier era, a storm making that leap in a single day was rare. In the modern era, it happens more than twice as often. That is the growth pattern. That is the thing scientists have confirmed. It is not a feeling that storms seem worse. It is a measured, published change in how fast these systems can grow. And the engine behind it is exactly that deep, warm water I was staring at on the buoy feed. And here is the part that turns a study into a warning that involves you personally. When a storm can double in strength in a day, your preparation window does not shrink a little. It collapses. Think about what that actually means at your kitchen table. The old model gave you days. You saw a Category 1 forecast. You had time to argue about whether to leave, time to get gas before the lines, time to get plywood while the store still had plywood, time to get your parents or your kids somewhere safe. The new model can hand you a Category 1 at dinner and a Category 4 by the time you wake up. Same storm, same night. And every hour you assumed you had is simply gone. If you want to go even deeper into understanding how these systems work, the fuel, the physics, and the forecasting gaps, I have been putting that research into something you can keep. My books, Storm Ready, Storm Signal, and Storm Protocol, walk through exactly this kind of investigation, layer by layer, in a format you can return to anytime a system is developing. They are available in the description below. If reading the water instead of the headline is the way you want to think from here forward, those books are built for that exact mindset. Now, back to the evidence that this is not theoretical. And this is where the recent history gets genuinely frightening. Go back to October of 2024 and the storm named Milton. Milton formed in the Gulf of Mexico over exactly the kind of deep, warm water I have been describing. And what it did next is one of the most extreme intensification events ever recorded in that basin. In a span of a little more than a day, its winds rocketed upward and its central pressure crashed. It reached sustained winds around 180 miles per hour. Its pressure fell to figures in the range of 897 millibars, and lower pressure means a more violent storm. It went from a system people were watching casually to a Category 5 that had much of Florida's Gulf Coast staring at evacuation maps in a matter of hours. Now, go back further to October of 2018, and the storm named Michael. Michael came ashore on the Florida Panhandle, and it did something forecasters historically assumed storms could not do. It kept strengthening right up until the moment it hit land. It made landfall as a Category 5 with winds near 160 miles per hour. There was no last-minute weakening, no merciful stall over the coast. It intensified into the shoreline, and the town of Mexico Beach was, in large parts, simply erased. And think about 2022, and the storm named Ian, which strengthened over the warm Gulf water and came ashore in southwest Florida as a high-end Category 4. The surge it pushed into places like Fort Myers Beach, and Sanibel rewrote what residents there thought was possible. 3 storms, 3 examples, in just a handful of recent years, each one fed by deep, warm water. Each one intensifying faster or later than the old rules said it should. That is not a coincidence I am inventing. That is the pattern from the study, showing up in the real world, at real coastlines, with real names attached. Therefore, the question I could not put down was this. If the deep water is loaded the same way now, and the pattern says overnight jumps have doubled, then why was the language on the current system still so calm? And here is the honest answer. And it is the first time in this video I am going to say something uncomfortable, because we are far enough in now that you have earned the full picture instead of the softened one. The reported version left something out, and it left it out for a reason that is not sinister, but is still dangerous to you. A forecast is legally and professionally built around the most likely outcome, the middle of the range. When the official cone shows a storm becoming a Category 2, that is the center of a spread of possibilities. But the spread is not symmetrical anymore. The warm deep water does not make a storm more likely to be weaker than forecast. It stacks the risk in one direction. It makes the surprise almost always to the stronger side, and the calm word gradually describes the middle of the range while quietly ignoring that the upper edge of that range is now a Category 4 scenario that the ocean is fully capable of delivering. So, who benefits from you hearing only the calm middle? Not you. The person who hears gradually and waits is the person standing in a gas line that has run dry, or on a highway that has turned into a parking lot, or in a home with no plywood left at any store in the county. The softened summary protects the forecast from looking alarmist. It does not protect your family. And once I understood that gap, I stopped trusting the summary and started reading the ocean heat content myself. I am going to show you how to do the exact same thing before this video ends. But first, I need to talk to the people who are already tuning out. Because I know some of you are listening to all of this and thinking, that is a coastal problem, and I live 200 miles inland, so this is somebody else's emergency. Stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you, and it is the part almost no coastal-focused coverage bothers to explain. Here is what a rapidly intensifying storm does that a slow one does not. When a storm explodes in strength over warm water, it does not just build wind. It loads the atmosphere with an enormous amount of moisture, and it carries that moisture inland long after the wind has died down. The wind is a coastal story. The water is an everybody's story. Think about what happened when the remnants of these strong Gulf and Atlantic systems pushed north. Storms that came ashore in the southeast have dumped catastrophic, deadly flooding into the mountains of western North Carolina, into Tennessee, into Georgia, hundreds of miles from any beach, in towns whose residents had never in their lives been told to fear a hurricane. People in the Appalachians died from a storm that made landfall on a distant coast. The wind lost its power over land. The water did not. The rain fell on mountains, funneled into narrow valleys, and turned quiet creeks into forces that took out roads, bridges, and entire neighborhoods. A storm that rapidly intensifies over the ocean carries more of that inland water threat, not less, because it drew up more moisture from that deep, warm layer before it ever hit the coast. So, if you live inland and you have been treating hurricane season as coastal news, that is the exact assumption the water is waiting to punish. So here is the one concrete thing I want you to do today. No matter where you live, coast or mountains or somewhere in between, find out right now, before there is any storm on the map, whether your specific home sits in a flood zone and whether it sits in an evacuation zone. These are two different maps, and most people have looked at neither. The Federal Emergency Management Agency publishes flood maps you can search by your own street address, and they are free. Your state and county emergency management office publishes evacuation zones, usually labeled with letters or numbers, and they will tell you the exact conditions under which your area is told to leave. Look them up today. Write down your zone. Put it on the refrigerator. Because I promise you this, the moment a storm is rapidly intensifying toward your region is the worst possible moment to be searching the internet for whether your street floods, while the power flickers and the websites are overloaded and everyone else in your county is asking the same question at the same time. The 5 minutes it takes you today on a calm afternoon is worth more than any amount of scrambling later. That is the single action that works whether you are on the sand or in the hills. Now let me bring you to the reading itself, the one I promised at the start, because this is the piece the news never hands you, and it is the piece that changed how I watch every storm. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration makes ocean heat content maps publicly available. Their laboratory in Miami produces them, and their satellite division updates the underlying data continuously. You do not need a login. You do not need to be a scientist. You can pull up a live map of the exact heat stored in the water across the Gulf and the Atlantic, and you can see for yourself where the deep, loaded, warm water is sitting. Here is how to read it in plain terms. The map is colored. The cool colors, the blues and greens, are water that will tend to slow a storm down. The hot colors, the oranges and the deep reds, are the high ocean heat content zones, the areas where that warm layer runs deep, where the number climbs past 90 and 100 units, where the storm's own churning cannot reach cold water. When you see a storm's forecast track crossing directly over one of those deep red patches, you are looking at the setup for rapid intensification before the forecast wind numbers ever catch up to it. And this is the secret the recent history hands you, the thing that makes this reading so valuable. The intensification shows up in the water before it shows up in the wind. The ocean heat content is high days before the storm strengthens over it. So the map is not a rearview mirror, it is a preview. When I watched Milton's projected path line up over that scalding deep water in the Gulf, the map was screaming what the word gradually would not say for another full day. Here is the specific thing to watch, the detail that ties this whole investigation together. The study from Rowan University did not just find that storms intensify faster. Follow-up work and the recent case histories point to something more chilling about where these jumps are happening. More and more of the rapid intensification is occurring close to the coast, in the final stretch before landfall, over that warm shelf water and those warm currents that hug the shoreline. Michael did it. It strengthened into the coast instead of weakening. That is the nightmare version, because it removes the last safety margin people always counted on, the old assumption that storms ease off a little as they approach land. So the full picture, assembled from the readings one at a time, looks like this. The deep water is loaded, and you can see it on a free public map. The published science says overnight jumps from weak to monster have more than doubled. The recent storms prove the pattern is already here and already lethal. And the intensification is increasingly happening in the last hours before landfall, when your window to act is already at its thinnest. The signal was in the water the whole time. It was overlooked in favor of a calm, middle-of-the-range word. And now, you are one of the few people who knows to read the water instead of the summary. That is the finding. That is the thing I could not believe was not on every screen this week. Let me tell you what to do with it, simply so it is yours and you can act on it. When a system is anywhere in the Gulf or the Western Atlantic and pointed toward your part of the country, do not wait for the wind category to climb. Pull up the ocean heat content map. If the projected track runs over the deep red, high heat water, treat the storm as if it is already stronger than the forecast says, and move your timeline up. Fill the tank early. Get your supplies while shelves are full. Know your evacuation zone before the order comes, not after. The water tells you first. Let it. Here's what I want you to carry out of this more than any single number. For years, I trusted the summarized version, the calm word, the middle of the cone, and I told myself that the people whose job it is to warn us would make the danger obvious in time. Then I watched storms double in strength overnight, while the language stayed gentle, and I realized the gentlest reading is not always the truest one. The ocean had been telling the truth all along, in a unit almost nobody looks at, on a map anyone can open. Now you can see what was hidden in plain sight, and you cannot unsee it. If you are the kind of person who would rather read the water yourself than be handed a softened version and told not to worry, then you already think the way this channel thinks. You want the real reading behind the headline, not the reassurance that goes stale the moment the wind picks up. So here is what I am asking you to do right now. And I am asking directly because this audience is too quiet for its own good. Tell me in the comments what region you are watching from. Coast, inland, mountains, wherever you are, name it. And tell me this specifically. Before today, had you ever heard of ocean heat content, the depth of the warm water, as separate from the surface temperature everyone reports? I genuinely want to know how many of you were handed only the surface number. Say it below. And if you want to be one of the people who sees the signal in the data before it becomes a headline, before the calm word turns into an evacuation order, subscribe and stay with me. Because the next thing I am tracking is a warm water current in the Gulf, the deep loop that broke Milton's records, and where its warmest core is drifting for the peak of this season. That is the reading I am watching next. And I will show it to you the moment the water starts to move. I read the data myself now. Come read it with me. Before you go, let me tell you where this goes next. Tonight was the overview. But inside the Weather Watch, I take you further, down to the heat content off your own shore. And you can ask me your own question. A real person, me, answers you myself. You won't be doing this alone. Weather watchers like you are already inside with me. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime, one click.